Hello and welcome to ATARC's AI and Data Analytics Virtual Summit. For those who do not know me, my name is Kirsten Patton and I am ATARC's Working Group Program Manager. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. We are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Thank you to our partners over at Octo, Confluent, and Tableau. We would also like to thank the ATARC AI Guidebook and Policy project teams for their help with these panels and the creation for today's event. Additionally, I would like to thank our panelists and you all for joining us today. We hope that you enjoy this informative session. Before we begin, I just want to encourage the audience to please submit questions of their own in the Q&A section of this platform. We'll be going through them during and throughout the panels, so please send them in as you go. Also, remember to answer the poll questions because that is how you are ensured to receive your CPE credits for attending this session. Up first, we will be hearing from our keynote speaker, Gregory Pappas. Gregory is the SHIELD team leader and the FDA CBER Associate Director. Gregory, over to you.
Hi, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be back here with ATARC, at least virtually. I've enjoyed the last, I think now 5 years I've been coming to ATARC meetings, and great to have an opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts. Let me share my screen first. And we'll start this presentation. So I'm going to start with kind of a sad note. When you train people and talk about how to give a convincing presentation, you always say, start with a joke or something to catch people's eye, that's funny and pleasant. Unfortunately, I'm starting this with a memoriam to Mike Waters. The work I'm going to be talking about today was started by a young man, Mike Waters at the FDA. I was more like his mentor and friend, who died during the pandemic. He committed suicide. The best word for it probably is the Japanese word karoshi. He worked, he was sleepless nights, working too hard, totally devoted to his mission. So with this, in his memory, I'm going to continue his work along with a very engaged and a large ecosystem that I'm going to talk to you about. The arc of my presentation is to start off with a little bit about AI in healthcare, where we are, what our limitations are going to be, are currently. I'm going to talk a little bit about interoperability, and those of you who know the area will realize that this is really critical to the issue of the use of AI in healthcare. I'm going to then go on talk and tell you about why I feel that lab is the low-hanging fruit for moving forward towards an interoperable health data ecosystem. Then finish by telling you about SHIELD, a large public-private partnership, like ecosystem that's working on this issue of lab interoperability and some planning efforts that we're doing. So that's the narrative or the story I'm going to tell during our 15 minutes together.
Gregory, I apologize for interrupting. We can't see your slides though.
Oh, thanks. Let me try that. Try again. Can you see them now?
There we go.
Okay, so there's my introduction and my disclaimer. And there's the picture of Mike and his family, lovely guy. And here's my narrative, my overarching narrative: AI in healthcare, interoperability, labs, and SHIELD. I also going to use a couple terms that we use at HHS. It really came out of FDA. One of our great commissioners, Rob Califf, a great leader in this area, coined the terms real-world evidence and real-world data. And this is data that's collected as part of routine clinical care. That's the term of art that we're using at HHS now, for those of you who aren't working in the health field. And So I start out with where we are in AI in healthcare, and many of you have read about the demise of IBM Watson, and there are some lessons learned. I don't want to be so negative. There have been a lot of successful examples, but mostly in the area of support systems. And there was a paper, there was a one excellent study about using AI to prevent readmissions, avoidable readmissions. But that is an example of a limitation because it's not as scalable. That is, you can't use the same software and sell it or use or trade it to other health systems because systems vary so widely. I have a few citations here of other places, but many of you probably follow this literature. I want to just mention, though, that the literature sometimes makes the point that doctors are the problem, that they oppose AI because they're fear they're going to lose their job. I really don't see this. In fact, I see serious physicians all over working with AI experts, trying to make it work. I've been involved with 2 projects myself, one with the American College of Radiology, working on machine-assisted reading of images, a very exciting project using AI, and another using a pediatric intensive care decision support tool. That's a grant at the NIH. So this is not the issues are really that there's a broader, and it's not just AI, it's a problem with real world evidence more broadly, kind of an unrealized promise. And there's a large literature on this. The story goes that there's this wealth of data, and it could be used in all these great ways to have all these great outcomes. And it's still our vision. It's what I hold to. But the reality is that we have this problem of healthcare isolated in databases, siloed, incompatible systems, proprietary software, databases that are difficult to exchange, analyze, and implement. I think this entire problem was really underscored in the U.S. response to the pandemic. I refer you to a New England Journal of Medicine article, failing the test, the tragic data gap undermining the U.S. pandemic response. I think the title says it all. The issue that I want to focus on, among the many barriers to the use of real-world evidence, is interoperability. And this kind of summarizes a lot of the issues, semantic, syntactic, and institutional. I'm sure most of you are aware of those issues. The syntactic interoperability, moving the data around, is probably the best developed. HL7 and FHIR are progressing, but public health has been moving large-scale data around for a long time. So I think we've got a handle on that. The question is, the problem is what we're pushing around, and is it useful when you aggregate it? There's a spectrum of interoperability in health data, from claims data at the near end. We use claims data routinely, we aggregate them, we use them, but it still requires a substantial amount of curation. Next in line, I would put lab, which I call the low-hanging fruit, and I'm going to tell you more about that. There's near future possibilities. Remote monitoring measurements are something that got a big boost during the pandemic, and there are possibilities for moving interoperability in that sphere. Then on up the line, and probably at the highest level, the major barriers, you can look at psychiatric care, where the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is really no longer something that renders what people are doing. If you talk to psychiatrists, it's just a billing tool. Institutional and semantic issues in the psychiatric field, and not just in psychiatric field, many parts of medicine make it difficult to aggregate data across systems and use it for the types of purposes we're talking about here. So why am I going to focus on lab data? Well, you got to start someplace, right? And lab data is extremely valuable for clinical support for many of the efforts that we're trying to use data, bring data together on. So it's a good place to start. Lab data has been digitalized for 40 years. I mean, it's been in a computer on a screen for a long time. At the base lab level, our CLIA system ensures the safety and efficacy of labs across the country. So we're starting with a highly comparable practice in a vast country and vastly different settings because of government oversight. And we have standards. Standards exist. There's lots of them. That's the old adage. The great thing about the problem with standards is there's so many of them, and that's where the problem starts. That labs do not currently apply the coding systems in a systematic way. They apply them idiosyncratically. It's as if we're all speaking English, but when it comes to writing it down, we don't have a dictionary to tell us how to spell those words, how to render those tests in code. There's not been an authoritative source of coding guides on how to use the various codes in what systems, to what situation. This has been well recognized in health for a long time. I refer to my colleagues at the American College of Pathology. They wrote an excellent paper. I'm not going to go through this, but it's something that has been very well described, as I say. And pathologists take this as physicians. They embrace interoperability to improve patient safety. Patients are harmed at times because of these problems with interoperability. When the coding gets wrong decisions are made, and patients suffer. So this is not just a statistical issue. It's something that goes right to the heart of the practice of medicine. I'm going to give you one example of the potential efficiencies. Why this is, give you an example of that. There's a really good reason to do this. Currently, to aggregate data, and we do it for many purposes, you have to do manual curation. And usually that's a team of nurses. And it's very time consuming and costly. There was one of our preeminent cardiologists, and he's also an informaticist at Duke, Jimmy Chang, who has re-engineered the data collection and the workflow in a way to capture data automatically. In the traditional case of curation, the nurse will have to go to various departments to collect data from different systems, sometimes from paper logs. Sometimes they have to talk to people to figure out exactly what has been done. So this is why this manual curation process is so time-consuming and expensive. The solution that we've been working on is a public-private partnership, 5 years in the making, and you can read about it online. Google MD EpiNet or MDIC and Shield, and you can read about Shield. Shield has about 70 partners now to bring together the various stakeholders that have joined together to create this authoritative source to move this forward, and that includes the diagnostic manufacturers, commercial labs, the laboratories, traditional laboratories, public health associations, EHR vendors, and all the relevant federal agencies, along with the standard organizations. So we've got a big group of people that have been working together now 5 years, meeting on a bi-weekly basis, working forward to solve this problem. Just to give you a sense of where the complexities comes, here's a simple example, actually, of a workflow where a sample for flu is collected, and you have to know what exact tool was used, what kind of test device, and here we have a device identifier, and then the question being asked: what antigen is it? Is it influenza A or B, which have a variety of LOINC codes to choose from, and then what's the answer? What results? Is it detected, non-detected? Again, and then all this data is necessary, and it's collected at various points in the process, making this even more complicated. I'm happy to report that Shield took a big step during the pandemic. Under the CARES Act, the Secretary of Health and Human Services was directed to solve this problem of coding and clean up the data for COVID testing. It was a big lift. It went into effect on April 1st, and I've got a series of citations for you here on the slide. These slides will be available to you, and I take this personally as a very historic moment. We've been waiting for this sort of government action for a while. The question is can we continue to build this response, address this interoperability problem with the momentum that we've created with the pandemic? And I'd like to say yes, we have the very good fortune in the change of administration to have Mickey Tripathi join the ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator. He is the national coordinator. That role is to, as I'm sure most of you know, to coordinate the data in the health field, and they also regulate the EHR industry. Mickey comes with a long history of understanding of lab interoperability and has made lab interoperability a one of the goals of ONC during his tenure. So we're thrilled. Mickey actually volunteered he found out about SHIELD, and when he came on, asked to volunteer, and now he's the chair of the SHIELD strategic plan. Actually, I'm coming fresh off of the strategic plan today. We had it this morning, and we launched our strategic planning process in a large ecosystem meeting. And what we hope to accomplish over the next 3 or 4 months is to articulate a strategy. We want to look at business cases to make it clear why this is going to have an impact, why implementing standards is going to help people, and then provide a roadmap, how we're going to actually do this. So this is something very kind of an audacious effort, but we're taking it on. And please join us. If you're interested in participating, you can contact me, and we'll find a committee for you to serve on and work with us to move this forward. I don't want to leave you with a negative feeling about an idea that I have a negative feeling about AI, but I wonder whether highly reliable organizations might be a way to restart the drive for AI. Highly reliable organizations are known to probably a lot of you, and it really builds, in my mind, on the long-standing learning healthcare system that started over a decade ago as an IOM workshop. This has really guided the strategy of the health field regarding the development of real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is the more recent iteration of this learning healthcare system. So I think if we back up a bit and focus on the systems that need to be collecting this data, we're probably in a better place to see a way to bring AI to its full utility in healthcare. To summarize, I'll be a little provocative and use the title of a chapter from a white paper that I helped prepare, the Pandemic Response and Emergency Preparedness Task Force of MD EpiNet, another public-private partnership sponsored by the FDA. And the title of that chapter was Health IT Needs an FCC. The foundation of the success of international banking, online shopping, and so much of what we take for granted today is interoperability that has been provided over decades by the FCC. We don't have a similar activity in health, maybe through additional authority, ONC could become that entity, but we need some place where this all comes together. So with that, I want to thank everyone for the attention. Again, thanks to ATARC for the opportunity, and thank you to your ecosystem, the ATARC ecosystem, for bringing together the perspectives in such a unique way and providing us with an opportunity to learn from one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. It's always great to have you at our events, and what a wonderful tribute to your friend. So thank you for sharing that with us. Up next, we will be hearing from our first panel, which we will be covering today. I'd like to introduce Ken Farber. He is one of our AI policy project team leads, and Ken will actually be providing a brief introduction. So Ken, over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten, and welcome everybody. And thank you all for your time today. What I'd like to do is introduce the first panel. We have, as you know, we have two panels today. The first one is on AI policy, and the second one is on the AI and data analytics guidebook. And so it's kind of like the policy is setting up and describing what we should do, and the guidebook is describing how. So to introduce the policy framework, just start with, what was the motivation? What were we looking at? What were we trying to solve? And it struck a number of folks on the team that AI has this unique set of characteristics. It's at the same time, it's a very significant societal impact we expect the technology to have. And the federal government has this interesting role where it not only uses and buys artificial intelligence tools, it creates them itself and it regulates them. So it's this very complex, seemingly complex problem about how best to create policy and enforce it. And then when you think about the complexity of the federal government itself and the need, because of the types of impact AI might have, the need to make sure that you've got a comprehensive and consistent set of policies across the federal government and all the different mission areas, how can you make sure that those policies are created and enforced? And so looking at it and thinking kind of, from a technical point of view and sort of like IT folks, to be frank, we looked at what's the best way to solve that kind of problem. So we think that if you can define all the areas of AI policy that should be addressed, if you can identify the organizations across the federal government that could play a role in defining and implementing and enforcing those policies, then possibly you could assign specific areas of policy to specific organizations. And it's really interesting because in preparing for this summit today, we had a conversation yesterday with one of the panel members, and and the experience that they had was that in trying to manage and define AI policy, you probably can't do it from a strictly centralized point of view. And it's also the case, we believe, that you probably don't want every federal agency and every part of every federal agency doing AI policy on its own. So this approach is an attempt to sort of meet it in the middle with a model that delegates the authority from higher levels of policymaking organizations to lower. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So here you'll see a diagram that tries to capture the idea that policies are created at a certain at levels of an organization, and within the federal government, in particular, policies are generated by different, generally statute-oriented organizations, but they then are translated into laws, and then those are turned into regulations. The agencies write themselves generally. And then you get standards and methods and processes implementing all of those policies. And we think this kind of chain of command is probably necessary for AI. And so the idea is that we'll be able to put together an assignment of different types of policies to different organizations with a clear representation of the scope of the AI policy that given organization will be responsible for. Next slide, please. And I'm apologize if we're going through these super fast, but this is just an intro to the work that our working group is doing, and then we'll move on to the panel. And here's the idea, here's an idea about how you might create categories of policy to look at. We don't need to go into the details, but the idea is essentially a network showing all the types of AI policies that'll be necessary, trying to clarify terms and understand the relationships between them so that when you assign them to the various organizations, you'll have full coverage of all the policies and you'll have accountability to organizations responsible for them. Next slide, please. And this is the outline of the report that we're developing. We try to give some of the context, then we'll present the framework. An important characteristic of the report is that we're not trying to define any particular policy. We're not trying to establish that or even suggest specific policies. Rather, what we're trying to do is give a framework such that the organizations in the government that do have that policymaking role can be sure that they are addressing the comprehensive problem and that they're able to address all of the different types of AI policy that are necessary. So that's a quick introduction to what we're doing. And if anybody attending online here is interested or believes that you might have something to contribute, we'd be very happy to have you join the team. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. That was a fantastic overview. Now we have our first round of panelists. If you all could please come on camera and make sure that your sound is on. We're going to have our first panel of the day. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for this panel, Kathleen Welch. Kathleen is the managing partner and principal analyst over at Cognilytica. Kathleen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and I'm excited to be moderating this panel. As Kirsten mentioned, I'm a managing partner and principal analyst at Cognilytica. We're an AI-focused research, advisory, and education firm. We focus on both the public and the private sector with how they're adopting and implementing artificial intelligence. And I am also the analyst chair for all of the AI working groups. So I'm excited with the work that Ken and that working group is doing and to be moderating this panel today. So I'd like to start by kicking it off, and we'll have each panelist introduce themselves. So Rob, would you like to go first?
Sure thing, Kathleen. Thank you very much. I'm Rob Albritton. I'm the Senior Director for the AI Center of Excellence within OLabs, which is a special projects and prototyping organization at Octo Consulting Group. We're a government contracting firm of about 1,200 people in Reston, Virginia. My background, I started my career in the U.S. Air Force on RC-135s, which are signals intelligence aircraft in the early 2000s. And then I spent some time in the intelligence community doing various types of technical collections work at NGA and a couple other three-letter agencies in the IC. I then spent some time at the U.S. Army, Topographic Engineering Center at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where I was a research scientist, and then kind of got fed up with government bureaucracy and made my way out to Silicon Valley, spent some time in Santa Clara working for the world's largest AI company, NVIDIA, or if you play video games, you probably know NVIDIA GPUs, graphics processing units, and then spent some time at MITRE, working on Project Maven and other pathfinding projects for the Department of Defense over at the Pentagon. Project Maven is one of the first large-scale AI programs within the DoD. And then now I'm at Octo, where I lead our AI Center of Excellence, which is, again, like I said, it's a core team of basically machine learning PhDs and master's level individuals that work on special projects and prototyping and really solving the government's most difficult problems. We're currently building a 14,000 square foot AI innovation center in Reston, and would love to talk with you guys about that at some point.
Great. And Ken is an honorary member of this panel, so I'd like him to go ahead and introduce himself really quick as well.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I was so excited to talk about the work. I forgot to, let everybody know who I am. So I'm the AI solutions architect at TechSynap, and we're a medium-sized consulting firm for the federal government, and we're bringing AI into a lot of spaces, primarily cybersecurity. So thanks a lot.
Great. And Cherian, you want to go next?
Thanks, Kathleen. Good afternoon. I'm Cherian Savanganam, Chief Architect at National Science Foundation. I've been at this position for 10 plus years now, and I also informally play the role of Chief Technology Officer. Currently, we don't have one. And my role is to lead the technology innovation efforts of the agency. And just to provide a brief overview of where we are with this, we have a grand vision at the agency that is to leverage emerging technologies. Number one, to enable digital assistance to our staff, and RPA fits very nicely in this use case. So we have a community of practice that has implemented about 15 plus bots. And number two, provide a super ability to our staff using augmented intelligence. And we have about 3 AI services that are implemented at an enterprise level scale, and it's widely available through the agency. And also we have about 10 plus AI experimental projects that are in nascent stages. And number 3, we want to crowdsource the challenge that the agency could not solve by ourselves. And this is where the blockchain fits very well. And we have a couple of blockchain experiments underway. So since today's topic is all about AI, I'm here to share our experience implementing the AI services at the foundation and take your feedback. So I look forward for the conversation or discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks. Gregory, can you go next?
Yes, thank you. Gregory Edwards. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor to the Office of the CIO at FEMA. I've only been in position about 7 or 8 months now, but I'm a career Air Force officer and over 10 years now in the DoD as a civilian. So experience in the IT field. I wanted to talk about the FEMA mission in terms of reminding you all, if you're not familiar with it, that simply put, it's all about helping people before, during, and after disaster. You all may have seen the mobile vehicles that respond in those particular areas when we have extreme situations occurring. You know, FEMA is an organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., and that's where our CIO sits. But we have 10 regions as well throughout the United States. We manage the enterprise services from a headquarters perspective, but we also have regions who have IT buying power and capabilities as well. You know, that's important because, you know, those regions are touching the state and the local, tribal, and territorial elements that are so important throughout the United States. Quickly, I wanted to tell the story of thinking of AI and FEMA. You know, could you imagine the day whereby there is a disaster and our autonomous vehicle pulls up, you know, to the site and it releases a robot, and that robot goes out and interacts with the local community, collects the information that's necessary, uploads that information, and processing occurs such that we can do what? So we can deliver what we do in terms of maybe some financial assistance, some grant, et cetera. But what stands in the way of that? Probably what we're going to talk about today, and that's all about policies, right? It's policies and procedures and guidance that will allow us to begin to use AI. So we're excited about AI in FEMA, but also quite cautious. I would tell you what we do today is mostly robotic process automation. And in RPA, we like the term process automation. We don't like the robotic aspect of it so much. We're concerned about the security aspects, you know, of that, and we're trying to protect private information, et cetera. So we have a couple of pilots ongoing. We call them proof of concepts, and that's where we stand. Now, in terms of overarching policy, I like Kent's point on that policy implementation framework, because it obviously is what we're following as a federal agency, and I think most are doing the same. We have an executive order, the number 13859, maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence, you know, authored by our previous president. And so that's put us on record now in terms of the federal government with our guidelines on what we are to do in implementing, developing policies, taking advantage of AI. So we're excited to be here as FEMA and look forward to any questions as well as participating in the panel discussion.
Great, thank you. Ed, you want to go next?
Sure, Kathleen, thanks very much. I'm Ed Mclarny. I'm NASA's lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning transformation. That doesn't mean that I run all AI for NASA. It means I'm trying to help act as an advocate, a catalyst, an organizer, if you will. I came to NASA after a 20-year career as an Army engineer and operations research officer. I have been working NASA transformation lanes for the last 10 years, to include data science, AI, machine learning for the last 3 or 4. Along with helping NASA scale our use of AI and machine learning to far more researchers, scientists, engineers, and business professionals across the agency. This last year, we've been working on an initial ethical AI set of guidelines. And so while it may be hard to craft perfect policy for the time being, we feel that we've got enough folks working in these areas that we need to provide them some kind of guidance. And so while the larger framework that Ken was describing evolves, we want to make sure that we've got a working draft of some kind of ethical policy on the street that can help guide our folks in the meantime. Glad to be with you today.
Yeah, that's great. I can't wait to see that when it's published. And Nathan, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Manzotti. I'm a director of the Data and Analytics Center of Excellence within Technology Transformation Services at GSA. What we do over there is we work with federal agencies that we partner with to assist in their modernization efforts. So I've had the opportunity to work with several different agencies. Before I joined TTS, I used to work at Customs and Border Protection and their data analytics group, working with their enterprise reporting system. And then I spent a long time at the DoD working at different capacities with the military healthcare system. So it was very interesting to hear Mr. Pappas speak earlier about electronic health record. I think it's a great opportunity for machine learning, and interoperability is an interesting topic to discuss in healthcare. So yeah, typically working on the data side more than the algorithm side. I'm very interested in how we prepare and transform the data that trains these AI models, and then verify the outcomes as the models are used. So interested to join the discussion today.
Great. Yeah, I'm so excited for this panel because we have a really diverse panel going on, from different agencies, different perspectives. So I'm going to start by kicking it off and asking the question, in your opinion, where do you think we are right now when it comes to AI policy? Who wants to get started? Maybe Cherian?
Sure. I think I'm going to say nascent. So we're very, very basic. First, when we began this effort in 2018, the first challenge for us is to really make sure our AI is trustable, to gain the customer. I mean, it was an augmented intelligence solution, so it is an optional solution for people to leverage. And initially, there were very little people really trusting it. And I think we started working from there to improve or increase the transparency. Right, that kind of helped us and to build the feedback loop. But still, we are at a very nascent stage. We know there are some bias in it. We know there are some training challenges and that need to be worked on. And it's still not making decisions. It's still only augmented intelligence. So I would say we are at a nascent stage, and we have a lengthier path to go on this.
Great. Yeah. Any other kind of, where things stand right now when it comes to AI policy? Maybe Nathan, Rob?
Sure, I'll speak to that. I agree that we are in the very early stages within my organization and organizations that we touch in the federal government. It runs the gambit, though. I will say there are some organizations who we've seen fully embrace and are, out there. It seems like light years ahead of others. USDI, for example, when you think about in the Pentagon on the DoD side, I think perhaps they are a bit further ahead than some of the medical organizations and academic organizations. But that's simply because, I think, they're putting AI into the hands of soldiers who have life and death, decisions that have to be made with these technologies on the battlefield. So it's a necessity that their policy is implemented as soon as possible.
Yeah. So moving along, when, now we've kind of established where you feel right now where it comes to AI policy, but now to create this policy, AI is a transformative technology, and like any transformative technology, it can take some time for laws and regulations they can be slow to catch up with the technology. It changes so quickly, it's adopted so quickly, and things just in general, I think, change as well. So you have to be careful. You don't want to build laws and regulations that maybe can be too rigid and strict, and then people can find workarounds for that. So how do you make and create policy that works for AI now, but that it can also scale to those future use cases? And how, understanding that this is so transformative. So Ed, maybe we can start with you.
So coming to NASA from the military, I always think that good enough now beats perfect too late. Like anything that's valuable to do, we just need to get started, especially where we know it applies to us as organizations. We might have to make some of our guidelines or policies aspirational rather than concrete, but let our implementers, our early adopters, at least think about the considerations, even if we don't know exactly what key performance parameters to measurements to put in. If we don't know exactly how to direct them, we at least need to point them in the general correct direction. I think there's a lot of, and just from this talk and other recent talks, it seems like there's a lot of energy around the government and our larger ecosystem to come up with some of these guidelines. And so, to me, where we need to, we can work some of them in good enough fashion internally. There's a lot that we can collaborate on. And looking at the hierarchy that Ken showed, hopefully we could work different elements of that hierarchy in parallel so that we don't play the proverbial, waiting for the next higher level to come down with 6 months at a time for each level in that hierarchy. Hopefully we could work some of those elements in parallel.
Great. Nathan, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, I think those great points, Ed. And to kind of piggyback off of that, talking about the issue of, should we kind of slow down and make sure we plan exactly what's going to happen, or should we, take the reins off and let innovation run wild? I think the key to doing that effectively is risk assessment. I think at this point, we should come up with, or it would help to come up with a clear risk assessment guidance that agencies can use to kind of label each of the use cases they have for AI to say, this is an application that could have a critical impact on the public, and this really needs to be planned carefully before we put something out there. And then, these other tiers of use case maybe won't have such an impact, and we should be looser with the regulations on what can be tested and what can't be. But even, in the lesser risk areas, I think it's important to consider how to measure outcomes and be able to, quickly adjust if there is a negative impact per se from use of an AI application. Because while, when you think high risk, you think risk to life and property damage, right? The more subtle, longer, term risks that can come out that affect society as a whole should also be considered.
And Ed, do you have a follow-up for that?
I was going to piggyback on Nathan's piggyback that we are thinking that some of our risk processes and our kind of our risk assessment ecosystem might be able to help us implement some of our ethical AI and other AI policies or concepts or principles even before we have them fully fleshed out, so that we some of our other risks are subjective, squishy human risks, and we've got to figure out a way to judge those. And some of our AI aspects may be in the same boat for the time being.
Yeah, following up on that, in general, what do you think are the issues, problems, and challenges that we're going to need to overcome to get government-wide policies adopted, across the entire federal government? Maybe Gregory, we can start with you.
Thank you very much. I was anxious to jump into the conversation. Thank you. I think we need to really decide what is it that we are trying to do with AI. There is so much that can be done in terms of the technology and how it can be used. And looking across the globe, we're a little behind smaller countries in that they have developed a strategic plan. And that strategic plan goes into very specifics as to what that nation is trying to accomplish. Let's harken back to cybersecurity. We kind of did similar things in that regard. So my answer is, or my suggestion is, let's figure out what it is that we want to do and then get a strategic objective, and I'm saying at the highest level, that focuses us on how we can use AI. Not that there can't be other innovations and opportunities, but if we can kind of focus our attention. Are we focused primarily on research at this point? Well, if that's where we all are, then we might, apply our resources in that area. Are we focused on building more capacity? Making sure that we have skilled AI and trained AI workforce and staff? Do we need to focus on the ethical aspects? Do we need to focus on privacy? So I think if we can, identify the top 5, so to speak, and then move out on those, we'll have more symmetry and probably achieve more effects in the area from a federal government perspective.
Rob, I'd like to get your opinions on this. You have a unique perspective of both the public and the private sector. So what challenges have you seen?
Yeah, I have to tread lightly, being being in industry now. I have seen, so number one, there are personalities involved, right? That's always going to be an issue. We're such a disjointed large government, right? And the missions are so varied. And so creating one single policy that fits everybody's mission is exceedingly difficult. I would say nearly impossible, quite honestly. And so, really what I see as the solution is a general guidance, high level policy, but then every organization has to create their own policies, right, that fit their missions. The NIH is not going to follow the same guidance and policies that the Department of Defense follows, right? And the Army even is not going to follow the same guidance and policies that perhaps the Marine Corps follows. And so, that's really a challenge. I mean, the fact that we're not, even that the small countries that are able to implement strategy on grand levels, that's awesome, but it's again almost impossible for us in the United States to do that. We can give general guidance, we're going to invest $1 billion here, $1 billion here, that kind of thing, but it's almost impossible to have a coherent, perfect strategy that fits every single organization within the U.S. government.
Yeah, they're either going to be very, very broad and very generic. Cherian, I'd love to get your thoughts, especially coming from National Science Foundation, who's a big funder of AI research. What's your perspective on some of the challenges we have with adopting an AI policy?
Sure. First of all, I'm not from the science side, so there's a lot more happening on the science side, mostly on the research. But I'm from the CIO shop, so let me tell you practically where my brain is with this. So first, I think that, just my opinion, nobody has got this perfected. Okay, everybody's learning. And the biggest risk I see is there's a lot we don't know. Right. And the only way we can get better at this is building a proper feedback loop. So every time when we put this out, like, we are saying like Canada's come up with a framework, China's come up with a framework, we have DOJ framework, we have like NIST framework. So all these are maturing. Everybody has not one thing is just comprehensive. So the way we have to approach this is just put this out and have a proper feedback mechanism built into it, so we capture this and we improve together as a group. There's no competition. This everybody has to be right, and so that's just my 2 cents on this.
And Ken, I know that the working group that you're on has done a lot of work around this. Do you have anything that you'd like to share with everybody?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. All the challenges that have been described so far are very, very real. Um, I think that there's a bit of complexity here because AI, in a sense, is extremely inaccessible. People just don't know what it is, and yet it has this cool name, and we've all seen the movies, so we think we kind of know what it is, but in reality, very few people are comfortable enough to say anything specific about what to do. So that's really a big reason why we were motivated to try to help with a framework that we're developing. And the way we're trying to solve that problem is, as Rob was mentioning, not everything will fit everywhere. And and Ed was also mentioning, it doesn't fit. Not everything fits with every organization. So if you have a hierarchy of policies, then you can establish at the real high level. Those are probably pretty straightforward. But then if you drill them down, they'll change as you go to different organizations, and that's kind of Rob's point. So if you federate, if you share the responsibility, but with clear lines of accountability, then you might have a chance of solving the problem. But one thing that we haven't had a chance to do is like would be a literature review of how often has the federal government defined, established, implemented, and enforced a standard set of policies on any topic. That would be something might be interesting to do, but we haven't had a chance to do that yet.
I think that's a hint that if anybody wants to help, you should join Ken's working group.
That'd be great. Thanks.
So this kind of leads into the next question that I have, which is, should there be guidance created on how AI systems should be used? And then if so, who would create these policies? And do we need some sort of centralized policy, or is it okay for each agency to come up with their own? So maybe Ed, we'll start with you.
So one thing that occurs to me is in some areas we may need directive policies. In other areas, we may need academia to help with best practices, best theories, et cetera. And it reminds me about 15 years ago, a really smart lady from the Naval Postgraduate School, Sue Higgins, told me that even at that time, we could not have engineered the internet to grow into what it had become, right? She said we created the internet based on a core set of standards, and it grew and morphed over time. So here, to me, if we're able to set up for our AI ecosystem some kind of core set of principles, some core standards, and then maybe let our friends in academia help guide us on the more intellectual pursuits of it. So I would say divide the labor between policy directives and intellectual exercises, and not disparaging intellectual exercises at all. Some of that's just too hard to put into policy. And then the other thing is think about what are the core principles, like some others have said here, that we need to put in place so that we can grow an AI ecosystem, even if we can't engineer one from scratch.
Great. And Gregory, I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I'm an objective kind of a guy, and so I'm kind of agreeing with what was stated there. But to the point of set some objectives and goals such that the policies can then support that achieving something. And again, I give the example of why don't we have a policy that talks about and it can be at various levels. I get that. We can't have a congressional policy, a presidential policy that drives everything, but a policy that sets goals that said, for example, we're going to have 50,000 grants, that are going to be set throughout the United States to achieve some end in the AI research area. We're going to have so many thousands of people who are educated in AI. Well, now I can set a policy, at my level to start driving the training program that I have within FEMA as an example to meet that goal. And then you roll all of it up and we have achieved a level of maturity, in the AI area.
Great. Nathan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I think going back to talking about what are the core components that need to be included, I think starting from a kind of tactical place and looking at the, the way an AI system works would be a good spot to start, maybe with creating some blanket directives in how we either evaluate off-the-shelf software or build it internally. So, and mainly, being a data analytics guy, I'm always looking at the lens of the data. I think, just the simple mechanism to document the aspects of training data, where every system that's going back to the risk assessment thing, for each use case of a certain risk classification, we need to know this amount of information about the data that, was used to train the system. And having a common, lexicon on how to describe based on the data that was used to train the AI, the scope that the application can be used in may be helpful to organizations. So that's kind of one level down of policy where it's more tactical, but those considerations could be important too.
Great. Now we have a question from the audience. So before I throw this over to Rob and Cherian to answer this question, maybe you can tie this question into your answer. So it's asking, there's so much talk around the democratization of AI. Curious if this element is a must-have for policy guidelines, or if it's okay if AI only supports outcomes implemented by senior leadership. So Rob, I'll start with you.
So no, it's not okay if it only supports outcomes implemented or driven by senior leadership. I think that's the wrong approach. So I know some of the panelists and I have spoken about this, and Ken, AI innovation, by and large, in my experience as a practitioner, I'm more on the, practical side. I actually build AI applications and deploy them to the battlefield. The innovation comes from small groups of individuals we've never heard of, right? 2, 3 engineers at an Army research lab, or at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, or places like that, right? It's not, and they're not being told by a senior leader what to do. They're given the freedom to innovate, and so the policy there is really hands off, almost. Do no harm, don't hurt anybody. Those kind of high level things, and then getting to democratization. We spoke about this all the time at NVIDIA. There are cases of coal miners in West Virginia who taught themselves to code Python, and then how to build machine learning models and deploy them. And it's just a beautiful thing. There was no policy involved there, right? It was people at the grassroots level teaching themselves a new skill. And anyways, I just love stories like that. The point is, I think the policy has to benefit everyone, from the engineer with 2 years of experience, the scientist with no experience, a new guy out of school, all the way up to senior leadership.
Great, thanks. And Cherian, can I get your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can't agree more, but I like to quote something here. I don't know if you have watched the movie called Coded Bias. I'm a big fan of that. So I'm going to say the challenge, there's a say, this is very true in the security world. Cybersecurity has to be taught upfront, not later, right? Very similar here. So I think we have to think about all these before, or even when you really think about the use case, when you're trying to solve a problem using AI. So the problem I see is most cases, and it goes back to your example, Rob, about the coal miners. So we've been thinking it's like an IT implementation, but it is not. And that is the fact, because when we are really getting our hands rolled up, writing a machine learning algorithm or developing a training set, we have an unconscious bias from ourselves, which we are putting it in the code. And that is what is causing some of these biases and how you train the data sets. So it's really, you need to think through this upfront and have, if you're really solving a problem that involves, developing an equitable solution, or developing transparency, trust. So you just need to build that upfront, not like you develop a solution and try to practice it later. So that is my theory. So in most cases, if you see, most of the AIs are behaving like how the people built it and where the people are coming from. So that is the biggest influencer in whatever the AI solutions that we create today. So that has to change. And then you really think on policy on top of it, how to really put a structure to it. So everybody who creates AI solution to be thought through the same format. And that's the regulation and policy where we should be working on. Just my 2 cents.
Great. Yeah, I enjoyed everybody's answers. I knew that question was going to get a lot of chatter, so I was happy to ask it because I wanted to hear everybody's opinion on it. Now, we are coming close to the end, so we don't have time to get through all the questions that we had worked up. And I know that we are getting some from the audience as well. But I did want to ask this one question because it kind of ties into what Cherian just said. How do we provide transparency into data that's used to train AI systems? I know some of the people on the panel are more data folks than they are AI folks. So what policies should be in place around data? For example, policies that limit bias. So maybe I will start with Nathan on this one.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, so I kind of touched on this earlier, but I think, just some thoughts on how to, in a structured manner, require the data to be explained that's used to train the models. And that, I think any application that's AI, any AI application is going to have that same structure, right? Where we're bringing data in, training the model, and then applying it. So describing not only where the data came from, but the characteristics of it and how, closely it models the environment in which the application is going to be used is going to be important. Meaning, and what I mean by that is, say, a model that was trained on data from, say, overseas somewhere, that's going to be used in a particular state or locality, that training data may not necessarily apply to the real world scenario within the area of use. So I think, that simple thing is important.
Great. And Gregory, do you want to go next?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Keep going.
Yeah, just one other thing is that I think it's important to consider when we talk about fairness, right, and bias. To break it down and talk in a more complicated manner, because sometimes it's not so easy to describe what's fair. Meaning, so if the goal is to represent the real world, scenario, right, to model that, there may be disproportionate numbers of, I like to talk about like facial recognition, for instance. If you were to use the entire US population to train a model, right, that would theoretically be the best representation of reality, right? However, that's intrinsically biased, right? Paring that down so that you have equal representation across different categories, right, could produce a less accurate model. So you could argue on both sides of the coin which is the best approach to take, right? So thinking about things that way is a little bit more, it's not so cut and dry, but I think it's important to have conversations around those matters.
Great. And Gregory, can we get your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much. Yeah, in FEMA, and I think broadly in the federal government, there's more thinking now on data as we create it to make it more shared. The old thoughts are, or current thoughts, I should say, are we create data and immediately it is to be protected and it is privileged information. But we want to flip that mindset to now to where that privileged information is a smaller percentage of the overall data that we develop. And then as systems are developed and as technologies want to take advantage of that data, it's a much easier proposition in order for innovation to then occur.
Great. Cherian, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So actually, we are talking about AI policy, and I'm thinking most organizations probably don't even have a data policy, which is really a foundational before you work on the AI policy, right? So because you just take out the algorithm, what is left out is pretty much the training data, which sits behind it, right? So actually, we started working on that. We are currently working on a data policy, which eventually will include AI, because most cases the data products include intelligence, right? Eventually, so predictive and prescriptive. So what we did to increase the trust on these data is to first document them. So like, we made sure these training sets have an inventory and they're published as part of the enterprise data inventory. You kind of build a lineage back to the data where the source of the data is coming from. Develop code books. Make sure some of these data that you are like building queries that are repeatable, so anybody can take this code and they go to the source and they can repeat the same stuff. And then finally, you make sure you review it with your legal and policy people, that you're not violating some of your legal and policy boundaries on this. Then you work to build the feedback loop on your training data. This is where you are really going to begin eliminating the bias, because without the feedback, everybody's going to think our data set's ideal and perfect until you see that, everybody, like Microsoft faces this or Google faces, everybody's facing it. Nobody has got this perfect. The only way we can get better at this is getting that feedback loop built in. Thank you.
Great. Rob, you want to go next?
Yeah, my opinion probably aligns a lot pretty closely with Nathan. I'm all about data provenance, and really it's about tracking where the data came from. And from a technical perspective, I'm always concerned. Let's say I'm working with the Air Force, I have to know exactly what sensor the data was generated by, where the sensor was operating, times of day, all of those kind of things. And we really have to understand exactly how the data was collected, without getting into too many details about how we collect data in the intelligence community and DoD. I think, and also I think I would add one more thing. It's important to make a delineation between bias in data and adversarial attacks. I see a lot of, and also model drift and things like that, and model performance. I see some chatter in the chat, and these are all different things. They're kind of they're hard concepts to understand if you're not in it all the time. But data provenance and understanding how data might have bias in it versus how a model performs over time. For example, most folks don't understand, or some don't, that the model performance degrades as soon as it is released into the wild. So when you train a machine learning model and then you go into inference phase, it starts degrading immediately when it experiences new real live data in the wild, right? That's a little bit different than bias, but an important note to understand.
Yeah, very important. And then Ed, let's wrap up this question with you.
A couple different thoughts, Kathleen, thanks. So I'd like to piggyback on something Gregory mentioned. Lost my train of thought on that. So I'll get back there in a minute. Well, actually, building practical systems and being brave enough to do so out loud, I think is the way I would paraphrase it. So one of the things is we're working to expose more of our data by default, or share it as much as we can by default instead of securing it or hoarding it by default. And so that's the thing from Gregory. The other thing, man, I'm sorry. I had two good points I wanted to make. I think I'll just go with that one. I'm sorry.
That's okay, because we actually have another question, so I'll kind of ask it, and maybe you can help answer this. Have you looked over the open provenance model, work that's leveraged ontology about 7 years old? And also we got a comment from somebody saying, you know, also about bias, and to counter bias, you need more diverse data, not just necessarily more data. So maybe if you have comments or can, you know, want to touch upon those.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the open provenance model. As far as bias, we're looking at kind of diversity in our data sets and diversity in our workers, our data scientists, our AI machine learning experts, because you know the data brings bias and the people bring bias. So we're looking at those aspects. I'd also tell you that our chief data scientist has pointed out that sometimes in a model you want bias statistically. Well, we don't want ethical bias in a model. So we got to be careful that we don't just try to say, hey, we need to get rid of all bias. And then I did remember the other point I wanted to make, Kathleen, and that is, so I mentioned at the beginning, I am leading one transformation thrust for NASA that's focused on AI machine learning transformation. One sister thrust is our data thrust, and we actually invested more heavily in data transformation than AI. And that's okay with me because, like Nathan pointed out earlier on, data is the foundation or the oil that all of this works on. The other thing is kind of thinking about transparency. We have another sister thrust in culture and workforce. And, you know, many times in large organizations or government, we can look at culture and, you know, chalk various things up to culture and just kind of write it off. But we're trying to take a kind of a pragmatic approach to culture, thinking about some of the specific behaviors that we might change, cultural behavior hacks, i.e., like Gregory was talking about earlier, making the choice to openly share information as much as we can, rather than hoarding it for ourselves. So to me, this is all kind of an ecosystem of transformation: AI, machine learning, data, culture, workforce, and other elements too.
Great. Well, I wish that we could have gotten to more questions from the audience. This was an incredible panel. It went by too fast, I think, but we are up at our time limit. So I want to thank all of you for participating on this panel.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Kathleen and panelists.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all. We can probably do a follow-up also where we'll take the audience questions and put them out for comment from the rest of the panelists, so they will not go unanswered. Thank you all. Up next, we are going to hear from our emerging technology talk of the day, Todd Bodecher. Todd is the Federal Solutions Architect over at Confluent. Todd, over to you. And you are on mute, Todd.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. My name's Todd Bodecher, but Bodecher is a great pronunciation as well, maybe even better. I am the Director of Streaming Machine Learning and also a Solution Architect at Confluent. The talk we're going to be giving today is machine learning in motion, and really, talking about the value of kind of moving the predictions or inference up in your production lifecycle, so that you have the answers immediately, right when you can use them the most. So the government, I'd actually like to start the talk off by asking a very, very quick question, which is, out of everyone on the call, how many of you think that it's okay to do large batch predictions, maybe once a week or once a month, depending on the organization, in order to get the answer? Thinking through use cases like predictive maintenance, where you need to run some type of report to see which components you believe on your aircraft is going to end up going breaking or going to stop working over time. Or maybe employee churn, where you believe that the employee is going to be leaving the organization in the next 30 days. Well, for me personally, throughout my career, I keep coming into these individual scenarios where you need answers as soon as they happen. And this actually talks to a broader trend that I believe is happening just in general throughout the federal government. It's that the mission is no longer static. The mission's always been continually in motion, but the data that we've used has always been, very static, sitting in a silo somewhere. And we would have to go out to it and run reports against data that is either, hasn't been updated in a couple of days, or if it has been updated, can take a little bit longer. And it's because the type of workloads that we're requesting from those traditional databases, the databases really weren't designed for that type of workload. Now, what we really need more than anything else is a capability, a platform that gives us immediate access to all the data in real time. And as the data comes in, we need the ability to go through and build analytics against it, maybe push it all to a dashboard so that we have a full understanding of what's going on at that very moment. And broader, the ability to be able to work at a much larger scale, globally, as is with some of our customers. Confluent's mission really is to help organizations get to that ideal future. The idea that data is no longer static. Data is not going to be put on S3 and then uploaded to your database or warehouse later. It's the idea that you need to take advantage of the data at the moment you get your hands on it. So we've created a whole new technology, a whole new platform to be able to help that, with Apache Kafka really at its core. So what does this really look like? Well, many of you guys are already familiar with Apache Kafka because it is the tool of choice for many organizations to take the data from those traditional sensors, or maybe even an external database, and to push it into a data warehouse. But a lot of the capabilities that a lot of individuals aren't currently aware of is that you can perform quite a bit of compute while the data is coming through the pipeline. I believe that this is the ideal place to put inference for your machine learning models. So that as you have multiple data sets, multiple sensors, going back to the predictive maintenance example, coming through the pipeline, you don't have to wait to put it all into a data warehouse or a data lake in order to immediately know that a critical system on your aircraft is going to go down. No, you can flag it immediately, ground that aircraft, and immediately fix it before you'll actually end up having any downtime. This is a huge capability, and it has massive implications for forward-leaning organizations. This is all really made possible from Confluent Kafka. Our distribution is a set of tools and capabilities that not only allow you to connect to those individual sensors or external data sets, but it also allows you to perform quite a few transformations or just get to the bottom line of why are you even capturing the data in the first place. A few notable examples that I believe everyone on this call will know that use this to deploy machine learning in production today are Netflix, Uber, and PayPal. Some of the examples are relatively straightforward, like Netflix's recommendation algorithm. As you guys know from stories, Netflix's recommendation algorithm is extremely compute intensive and requires a pretty significant investment in order to do it. Well, they've been able to standardize and make that entire investment quite a bit cheaper and a whole lot faster for the customers by leveraging inference directly inside of Kafka. Uber is another great for instance, where they're going through collecting quite a bit of data on each and every passenger that's coming through, in addition to drivers, and performing analytics almost exclusively with Apache Kafka. Additionally, PayPal uses the platform for fraud. So the moment an individual is hacked, their PayPal account is hacked, and a fraudulent transaction happens, they'll immediately be able to alert them all through Kafka. So why Confluent, and really what are the key benefits other than just speed? Well, the time to accessing data is significantly faster, especially if the data is already coming through the pipeline in order to populate any traditional databases, warehouses, or your traditional analytic systems. You can easily combine multiple features and data sets together from disparate data sets. And you can even tag those individual groups, going back to the policy discussion, being able to track back exactly where each and every piece of data comes through for the model. This is an amazing capability for machine learning pipelines. But there's also a huge capability around data governance and just the ability to experiment quite a bit faster here. Around model training, you have real-time access to real data so that you can immediately retrain any model, going back to the last comment about the model degrading as soon as it goes into production. So this capability allows you to quickly retrain the model while also pushing live data over to the production model. It's not listed on this slide, but something else I'd really like to highlight here is that this also provides you a real-time capability to be able to immediately understand how performant your production model is, while you're also feeding new data to a next generation model. Huge capability, extremely easy to do inside of Confluent Kafka. Lastly, there's a significant decrease in the time that it takes to deploy machine learning models, either from batch to real time in a very low latency way. You can do this very easily through using a sidecar method, where you can immediately attach a microservice directly to the side of Kafka, so that your individual workflows are quickly being rerouted into that production server, which could be scaled almost indefinitely. Or, more importantly, you can turn it into a Kafka Streams application so that it scales like every other native Kafka application. A few relevant examples that I believe everyone on this call should be familiar with inside of the federal space, where this is applicable or currently being used, are around supply chain optimization, proactive health monitoring for HHS, predictive inventory planning for Department of Labor, false positive detection for sensors, primarily used around DHS, however, could be used in quite a few other agencies, resource optimization, fraud prevention, predictive maintenance, cybersecurity, and automated quality assurance, primarily around some of the work currently being done at the Air Force. I'd like to highlight that there are a certain number of use cases for machine learning where it's just not good enough to wait till the next day in order to get the answers. There's definitely some times where you need the answer as soon as humanly possible. And that's really where Confluent Kafka comes in to help. I really do appreciate everyone's time. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Todd Bedeker, and it was a pleasure.
Thanks, Todd. Sorry for butchering your last name, but that was a great presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, we will be hearing from another working group project team leader, Yvonne Cole. Yvonne will be giving a brief introduction for the final panel of the day. Yvonne, please take it over.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Kirsten. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Hey, I really appreciate the conversation so far. I just want to take a moment to introduce you to my office and some of the projects I have, and then discuss a little bit about the IDA Guidebook. So I'm with the Federal Electronic Health Record Modernization Office, the FIRM. The FIRM is responsible for implementing a single common federal electronic record, so EHR, starting with the Department of Defense, Veterans Administration, and the Coast Guard. One of my responsibilities is to establish guidance that identifies data standards that support seamless integration of health data between the federal EHR and legacy and community partner systems. I also lead the metrics and analytics team to collaboratively define and report progress in the areas of standards adoption, community partnerships, department integration, and population health. As a partner in ATARC, Mr. Ken Farber, who you were introduced to earlier today, Mr. John Griffith with MITRE, and I are leading an effort to develop an artificial intelligence and data analytics guidebook. So this guidebook will act as a single reference for project managers, CIOs, and senior managers in the federal government responsible for implementing AI and data analytics in their organization. So as discussed at the earlier panel, this guidebook will include best practices, key terms of reference, resilient and repeatable models, as well as supporting use cases such as standards for analytics and Mr. Pappas's SHIELD project. We have a number of partners to date. The guidebook is currently under development, and we are looking for additional partners. We're hoping to release for comment in the end of August. Some of those departments are the Department of Health, GSA, MITRE, NASA, NIST, and the Office of National Coordinator, as well as the Veterans Administration. So if you're interested in contributing to the guidebook, we do host a bi-weekly development team meeting. or if you have similar initiatives that would complement the guidebook, or if you're willing to provide comment, you can reach out to myself directly or the ATARC support team. Thank you for this time. Back to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Yvonne. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Schmelzer. Ron is the managing partner and principal analyst over at Cognilytica as well. So Ron, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We hope you are enjoying this fabulous webinar. This is quite a great fire hose of information, and definitely you're going to want to be replaying this as well. There's so much good stuff here. But we're very excited about this panel here to talk further about the guidebook that Yvonne just spent some time mentioning, and just talking in general about how we can advance the state of AI adoption within the government, and talk about some of those roadblocks of which you would probably not be surprised, much of which is not really technical. So I am really joined here by a fabulous panel. I am Ron Schmelzer. I'm a managing partner and principal analyst at Cognilytica, and Cognilytica is a research, advisory, and education firm focused on AI, machine learning, and cognitive tech. And we spend most of our time looking at the markets, over 20,000 vendors in the market space. We also track best practices and use cases and adoption and implementation, and where things get stuck. And, you know, very much like an analyst firm, that's basically what we do. But I'm joined here on this panel focused on the AI guidebook, and talking a bit about the policies and practices, the methods, the processes that we could use to ensure that the technology for AI is ethically, effectively, and efficiently put into practice. And as you can imagine, there's lots of moving parts in making that happen. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, then I'm going to have them go and introduce themselves a little more, talk a little about themselves and their agency and the AI projects they're working on. And we got lots of questions. And of course, this is really all about you, our audience. So don't feel shy about contributing your questions or your chat. We are definitely keeping an eye on that. We want to make sure we have time for all of your questions. So I am joined here by Gregory Pappas, as you might have heard earlier, Associate Director for National Surveillance. Also joined by Brian Lane, who's the Director of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the GSA, General Services Administration, by Scott Beliveau, who is the Branch Chief of Advanced Analytics at the USPTO, our innovation agency, and Josh Gilmore, who is the Principal Solution Engineer and AI Evangelist, Public Sector at Tableau. And maybe I'll go in that order, have you introduce yourself. So Greg, you're up first, then Brian, then Scott, then Josh.
Thanks, Ron. Greg Pappas, you know me from the plenary. I know I didn't introduce myself. I wasn't quite sure about the flow, but anyway, I'm a physician. I've been at the HHS for many, many years, doing public health. Got a PhD in anthropology, but I've spent most of my career doing data, and find myself at the FDA doing real world evidence, and very exciting. After a long career, I started my career at the National Center for Health Statistics, which used to be big data, you know, many, many years ago. But we were beginning to see real world evidence coming in. The EHRs were beginning, and now we're in a different era, and it's very exciting to see this next phase.
Thank you very much. And now Brian.
Hey, thank you. Ron, I'm super pumped to be here, especially with such an incredible panel. My name is Brian Lane. I am the co-founder of the AI Center of Excellence at GSA. I can share a little bit about how the Centers of Excellence work. We were an initiative founded by the White House a couple of years ago with the idea of partnering with federal agencies to help them with their IT modernization projects that span the enterprise-wide scale, right? And so we've partnered with agencies like Department of Agriculture and Department of Labor. In my full-time day job, I am the site lead for our engagement with the DoD Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And in that engagement, we are supporting them in creating data governance and data management practices for the Joint Common Foundation, which is the DoD's AI platform. We supported them with acquisition strategies for data readiness, test and evaluation, and a number of other mission specific domain areas related to AI. And then in my current role, I'm supporting the business process transformation portfolio, which includes things like Game Changer, which is now an open source, free and open source software tool that can be used to access, evaluate, analyze policy documents, requirements documents, and other things. So very excited about open sourcing that project and making it available to the public, starting to build a community around how to do real, no kidding, data-driven policy analytics. Thanks.
I like that. No kidding, data policy, data-driven analytics. Let's all hope for that. All right, so Scott, introduce yourself and tell us a little about what you're working on.
Sure, thanks, Ronald. His name is Scott Beliveau. I manage here at the USPTO or like many feds wear a lot of hats, managing our big data programs, our open data efforts, our advanced analytics, as well as a number of our AI efforts here at the USPTO. Sort of some background, our mission here at PTO is really to timely issue quality patents and trademarks and to disseminate information. And in doing so, we grant the rights to exclude so that folks can build the next new innovation, the next cool idea. We're a fee-funded agency. We receive about 500,000 patent applications, about 1 million trademark applications covering everything under the sun. So it kind of gives some idea on the data side. We get a lot of data going on within that part. And as you were saying, as part of America's Innovation Agency, we're actually have a number of emerging technology efforts underway, looking at kind of augmented intelligence type efforts with our workforce, which falls under machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, as well as a lot of process improvement activities with RPA, blockchain. But I think for today's discussion and a little more on the more traditional space, currently we have the big 7 AI efforts that are going on within the USPTO. They're all in different stages of implementation. We've got some in full-blown operational production with active and passive feedback loops going on, integrated within our work processes, to some others that are a little more still baking in the oven, as it were. With that, happy to join conversation and chat more today.
Well, fantastic. All right, now, Josh, share with us kind of what you're working on. Tell us a little bit about yourself and clue our audience in.
Great. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm a principal solutions engineer working for the public sector over at Tableau. Tableau is an analytics solutions company. In the private sector, we basically touch all areas that you can imagine, both in the private sector, public sector, all around the world. So pretty well-known name and commodity within the space. I actually started out my AI journey working on operationalizing machine learning for national security. So many moons ago, back in 2012, I was working on issues around the world, Syria, Ukraine, that sort of interesting area with large-scale network analysis, and making machine learning consumable for intelligence consumers with a lot of the products that we had. So I was also a security contractor where I worked on a large-scale enterprise implementation of a modeling project. And so what I've done here at Tableau is I've taken a lot of that background after joining about 1.5 years ago and started to integrate that both with our product and really focusing in on the public sector and the consumption around AI. So I've been taking the lead here on a white paper that we're going to be releasing. It's going to include content for executive audience, managerial level, to really make it understandable and how a lot of business users across the public sector can use AI and machine learning to really enable their decision making. And so part of that, and really here at Tableau, one of the major challenges that we come across, because we have all sorts of large scale analytics implementations, is it really comes down to a cultural aspect. This developing and fostering this culture of data-driven decision-making is always at the forefront of what we're doing. And so when we've been looking at democratizing AI in the same way that we've democratized data, that is one of the major areas. So the key thing that I've really honed in on here, and given all my past experience and talking to people throughout national security and public sector on AI, is consumability. How can we enable decision-making? And especially with the specific needs of the public sector.
Well, fantastic. I know we have a bunch of questions. Actually, we're already getting some questions from the audience. And so maybe even just quickly before I get into our little pre-questions, first of all, Josh, I want to mention someone had already asked for links to the white paper. So if you feel like posting them into the chat, you can, or we can share them afterwards, whatever works. Actually, I'm wondering if Yvonne is still here and joining us, because we have a question about the guidebook. And sort of before I get into the panel questions, maybe I just want to ask this question. So just Yvonne, are you still joining us here? I know you're on the phone.
I am, yes, thank you.
Great. The question has to do with, does the guidebook address intellectual property? That's this sole question.
Not at this time, not to say that it cannot. So like I said, we have a development team that meets bi-weekly, and we have come up with a number of topics, but obviously as we go through the review and folks continue to engage, additional topics may be added.
Fantastic. Okay. Figured that was an easy question, easy answer. And I would say for those of you who are listening, there are opportunities to participate. So if that's a key important consideration, you should. We do have people here who are concerned with intellectual property for their day jobs. So actually the first question has a little bit to do with the guidebook, kind of more from just the general perspectives of like, I'm going to maybe I'll start with Greg, and we'll work down our way that way, or you can jump in as you will. But really, the main question is, what do you see as some of the most critical aspects of putting AI into practice in the government?
Hi, thanks, Ron. It's happening. I mean, I'm not pessimistic. It's just, as I say, in the areas of application, in the business applications and systems application at HHS, where data is a little bit more normalized, got better potential. But in the massive amounts of data that we collect on health, I mean, Medicaid data is a good example. I'm going to say the same thing again and again. The data is not in great shape. Medicaid is 50 states and 7 jurisdictions. They all collect the data differently. It's all supposed to be about poor kids and their health. There are other parts of it. That's the main thrust of Medicaid data. And wouldn't it be great to have that data all together in one place? Problem.
So obviously data, key element of making AI work. I'm sure, Brian, you've seen this quite a bit. Does that usually the main stumbling block, or are there other cultural or other issues that are sort of getting in the way of really advancing AI efforts?
Yeah, great question. And of course, it all goes back to data, but there is one thing I want to say, right? Last year, when we stood up the AI Center of Excellence, the theme of that year was kind of AI is achievable. Let's start the journey. And what I'll say this year is that our theme has been AI as a team sport, and finding the right people to bring together in order to execute AI related projects. So here's a couple of things that I'm thinking about specifically towards product development activities for AI in government. The first one is, I really have been thinking about active learning systems and their architectures and how they're constructed. And so what I mean when I say active learning system is you have a human that's doing a task, right? Let's use reCAPTCHA as an example. That's a great one, right? I forget my password and I have to pick all of the pictures of stoplights and crosswalks and whatever. And so now I'm essentially labeling training data for a machine, right? Well, we have tons of federal employees in the government that are doing similar tasks. They're evaluating policy documents, they're evaluating financial transactions. And so when I look at the systems as they exist today, they're not active learning systems. And what I'm seeing is a lot of pop-up one-time model implementations based on static data, but what we don't have is the feedback loop that goes back and forth between the user and the data and the process over and over and over again and gets better over time. So I'm really thinking about active learning systems and how to deploy those across the government for a wide range of tasks. And then the second piece that I think is incredibly important is decoupling knowledge engineering and experimentation from the rest of the data management activities that take place. So you have your engineers that are in charge of like getting the data to the right place and ensuring the data is secure and whatever. But what we need to have decoupled from the application and from the process is a knowledge engineering team that does things like feature development and model experimentation and testing to feed mechanisms into that active learning system to make the system better over time.
Excellent. Yeah, it always comes down to improving learning, and not just of machines, but of people. And speaking of sort of the this issue of knowledge and data sharing, I know, Scott, there's some really interesting considerations, especially at the PTO, because you're looking at trying to do things like uncover prior art and look for comparison marks and trademarks, even in sources that are not even the English language. So, you know, how do you, I'm like, that's quite a challenge. How do you find prior art for something in, say, a Korean patent filing, you know, when you don't even know what the lexicon is like? At least I don't. So maybe you could talk a little about that, or some other challenges that you may see that might be unique to some of the things that you're looking at.
Yeah, if I could just quickly, kind of pivot back to some of the earlier comments, and I think some folks have touched on this. It's really kind of important to think about and understanding what AI is or isn't. From the perspective of AI isn't new. It's not magic developed by elves living in Rivendell. It's math, it's computer programming, it's made by people, and it's achievable. Really, as Brian was mentioned. And, when you look at kind of the problem you mentioned, we always have to try to tie in terms of implementation to a business goal. So, really it always comes down to the people involved in tackling that particular problem, and it's cultural, as Josh referenced, where people are doing work on a process, and, with that and other technologies, that may be construed as disruptive or otherwise, that's kind of where that particular process comes into play. Now, for some of the use cases where you're getting into trying to determine things like, within the patent process, it's usually, we're searching for something which someone says has never been done before. So it's a different sort of search problem. And where we try to design systems, I think going back to, Brian's, we've had to design these active learning systems where, we've looked at the business process by which we go through examination and trying to see what people are normally doing as part of their natural activities, and look at the data points that we can capture then as part of that process to feedback and reinforce the particular models. So example for something like translations, there's two different ways you could approach it, and we've looked at both. One is sort of, let's say, the more brute force attack, which is, we pay somebody for the machine translations or the actual translations, and we just search on that. Another way to do it is, well, if we know what people from the examiner's side are relying upon to make the basis of their legal or argument decision, that can serve as a proxy to the actual translated text that we can use as a signal to feed back in to basically come up with the answer without having to do the actual, particular transactional or translation type activity.
Excellent. So, Josh, yeah, please chime in on this question of sort of like advancing the efforts of AI and some of the roadblocks or some of the things that you're seeing that can help move things forward.
Yeah, and I might as well elaborate a little bit on the consumability aspect. And one of the things that I've seen before, even when implementing some models on my side, is even if you have an extremely predictive model, but it never enters into decision making, so it doesn't become consumable, so what? It's not really achieving its intended objective to impact decision making within the bureaucratic framework. So there's an immense amount of subject matter expertise that we find amongst various bureaucrats, decision makers, and analysts who are out there. And so really it comes down to maximizing this. And so when I do talk about this consumability piece, it really comes down to these business aligned outputs, fostering trust through gradual introduction of AI, incentivizing participation for bureaucrats, which is a very specific kind of need on bureaucratic level, and then fostering business-led initiatives as well too. And so when I do talk about really this kind of like business aligned outputs piece, as a visual analytics company, I can't miss the opportunity to say that making a lot of the AI pieces visually consumable, especially from a cognitive standpoint, really opens up the ability for people to interact with various AI models that are being produced. Not only that, you can produce parameters that are interactive, which really gives this idea of having a sense of control with AI. And it's funny because really fostering trust has been one of the biggest pieces, where I can take someone's data, I can put it into Tableau, they can explore it. But the moment I push and run through a machine learning model and comes out the other side, people inherently become distrustful. So really, by giving this aspect of control on over to people, they're going to be more likely to trust the models at the end of the day. Because as a bureaucrat, you have to be very transparent about your decision making and what it is that you're owning. And so incentivizing this participation piece, really, it should be a net reduction in terms of time. So when I meet with CDOs and their data science groups who are out there, really focusing in on this business aspect of what is it that's really repetitive? How can we reduce that? AI doesn't necessarily have to be a model implementation. You can use natural language processing. You can use object extraction from images. And those are really, really nice and easy ways to ease people in to the realm of AI, because these are going to benefit their decision making. They're going to offer up immediate feedback. And in fact, there's an energy regulator who's been using Tableau and a combination of some deep learning with Spacey to do some entity extraction. So what they're doing is they're taking this entire policy repository of 70 years worth of data, running through it and making it consumable for their policymakers, jurists, anyone who's been involved on the legal aspect, citizens, and that kind of thing. And then making that publicly available so they can get at what they need faster. And then the final part to this is expect that your AI is going to come from business-led solutions. I think there was another speaker who was talking before, that a lot of the initiatives that he's seen have come from people. This right here is a Jetson Nano. This is $100, operates on 10 watts, can put through neural networks for image and video object detection. And in the same way that what we're doing here with Tableau is, if it's on someone's desktop and they can actually roll out these kind of AI initiatives, it becomes a major aspect that has to be considered within policy. So really, this comes down to looking at a facilitatory framework for AI groups within departments to really kind of tackle this. And so also looking at interdisciplinary teams, we're going to have social scientists and business users as well.
Great. Well, sounds good. Well, as you were speaking, someone was asking some questions about doing machine learning in Tableau. So you may want to check that. I just mentioned they actually did casually remark about that. Well, one of the things that I know we're focusing on with the guidebook has somewhat to do with standardization. Of course, that word itself is a little overloaded, it means a lot of different things. But I think really the effort is to try to synchronize or trying to align a lot of the efforts of the government in terms of practices and processes, maybe different means and methods of access. So maybe start with Brian, because I know that you've been doing some work here on various different guidebooks, whether this or others. And you could talk a little bit about, like, is this possible? Is it possible to standardize efforts? Are we all kind of doing different things, cross-functional wise? I mean, what's possible to standardize? Maybe some of these other panelists, please jump in, talk a little bit about those efforts, whether it's process, data, shared services, however you want to tackle that.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So here's what I'll say. I think there's two efforts that we've done that have been really helpful to our agency partners. The first one is when we execute an engagement, along the way, we gather best practices and lessons learned. And this is one of the main functions of a center of excellence, right? We're kind of a hub and spoke model. We deploy out to other agencies. We listen to their pain points. We help them solve some challenges. We take those lessons learned and then we bring them back and create resources for the rest of the federal government, and really in many cases for the public to use. So in this process, we've created a number of playbooks and quick start guides. We have a cloud adoption playbook. We have a data and analytics playbook that are published on the COE website. We've also delivered some artifacts such as DevSecOps best practices, code sharing best practices, and things like that that are really part of the toolkit for any agency that is embarking on an AI journey. And that's not to say that these documents are, the canonical checklist of how to do AI, but certainly it's a starting point. And what we find happens is as we jump from agency to agency, we refer back to the reference documents as a starting point, and then we say, well, your organization is slightly different, and so this is how we have to tweak it and modify it to make it useful in your environment. The second thing that we've done, which I'm really excited about, is we created a framework for an AI capability maturity model. And I'm a firm believer of it's very, very difficult to embark on the AI journey if you don't understand what your current state is and what your objectives and strategies and performance indicators are for the future. And so when we deploy this AI capability maturity model, and I'm not going to call it an assessment or an evaluation because that's scary, right? We want to make observations about where an organization is. No kidding. Where are you at? Do you have data scientists that are working on standalone laptops? Are they on loan from another organization? Do you have a cloud, infrastructure and platform shared service that you can use? These are some of the questions that we get at to observe the current state. And then we look at the organization and say, what are your strategies, your goals, your investment profile? How are your programs set up? What acquisition vehicles are available to you? What legacy systems are rolling off? We look at all of these things and we help agency partners map out steps to get to where they want to go. And when we make that roadmap, we can identify curb cutting effects to say like, hey, if you invest in your cloud infrastructure and platform, not only will that give you the tools that your AI team needs in order to get up and running, but it also helps these other stakeholders in your environment. Then we can build little coalitions to execute, which I think is the most exciting thing. As I said before, like AI is a team sport and we got to bring people along the way as we get to that. So those are the two things that we've got, the best practices guides and the AI capability maturity model. They've been very effective for us so far, and I'm really happy to share almost all of the work that we do. It's almost all publicly available, save for a few items.
Hey, Ron, I think you're on mute.
I was doing the push to talk. I guess that didn't, the push worked, the talk part didn't, or the talk part worked, the push didn't. So Greg, I'm saying, I think you might have seen your fair share of standardization efforts and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about sort of just in general, the goal of trying to synchronize all this, and maybe from what your perspective, prioritizing efforts around guidebooks and standardization and things like that?
Okay, here I am unmuting. Where we have good standards, the work is going swimmingly. I mentioned a case with in radiology. Radiologists have huge workloads. They've gotten to the point where they ship readers images over the internet overseas to have international teams looking at them because there's so many images to read. So the prospect of machine reading to help support the reading of screening, initial screening, identification of things for people to look at, these sort of things are very palpably of interest. Radiology, because it's at its root high tech, these radiologists are way ahead of most other medical specialties, and the American Society of Radiology has a large scale project on machine reading assistance of radiology. What makes it all possible, though, of course, is Diacom. There's a standard. All of radiology has the images, the pixels, are all highly standardized, so we know what we're working with. We have trouble when it gets to terminology and those other things, but that's the frontier of where it's already being used to triage images to people, to send the right image to the right radiologist at the right time for reading. Already that happens. That sort of triage is happening a lot. As I say, in the business applications, AI has already found a niche. It's not going away. It's just I'm looking to the future. I'd love to see clinical decision support as part of your EHR. to be able to click on an AI tool to help you make decisions in the clinic in real time for a patient. We're not there yet. The vision has been there for a long time, but we're not there yet.
Hey, Scott, I mean, what are your thoughts on standardization and guidebooks and things to help keep things aligned?
So I'll try to maybe take a little bit of a slightly different twist on it, but I think it's along the lines of what Greg was mentioning. As I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of stuff with data within the USPTO, manage a lot of different types of data. So data is really my capital, or liquid capital. I look at it as something that sits there until we can invest it. And how do we invest it? Well, we invest it to help empower entrepreneurs to innovate, create new opportunities, or we leverage it internally to really drive those business decisions within our organization. I think Josh has kind of been touching on a little bit. And I think, but as I noticed before, it really comes down to when it comes to standards, enabling business goals. And I think one of the questions within the chat talks a little bit about funding streams, and I'm not organizationally, I'm not getting a budget to really explore for the sake of exploring. I'm getting a budget to deliver, and deliver business cases values. Now, with those particular, business case values that we're delivering, I'm nudging along on my roadmap. So I deliver the business value, but I always am looking to set it up for the next idea that we can ideate, put it out there and win. So for standards, really, what I'm looking for is that construct of often used as using data as a strategic asset. It's the data federal strategy, data reform, because that really dovetails, or that data governance efforts is what's avoiding this construct of a data tower of Babel, as it were. Because data is such a team sport and AI is such a team sport, I need to make sure that I've got my IT leaders talking on the same page as my business leaders, and vice versa, to really understand and align that data or the context of that data, so that we're making sure that we have this shared understanding of delivering what is meant by value or returns or the goals that we're trying to receive.
Josh, you got the name drop on that one, so why don't you pull up and talk a little about what you're seeing as well.
Sounds good. Scott set me up nicely. So one of the things that I think is really helpful is having a centralized, and I'm going to say the audit word, an AI audit, evaluation, whatever you want to call it, something that is really standardized and systematic across the board, but it's not going to politically penalize the innovators, and can act as a tool to really sort of receive facilitation from an AI group and create a transparent output for public consumption at the end of the day. And part of that as well too is really enabling this understanding of stewardship, because in the government, people are going to shift on out of their roles, and you don't want stagnant AI pieces sitting in and being part of decision making, and then that can really result in real world problems down the road and really reflect poorly on what AI is being adopted. The other part here, because resources are inherently limited, is it's actually a really good talent scouting resource. You can go in, you can identify what are some of the high value projects that are out there. Use a centralized body who can go in and help to facilitate these kind of implementations. And then the final part here too is, it's not just about having these external, keepers of AI knowledge, but actually having business-driven audits. And the way to sort of think about this is where you have real-world outcomes. If I have two pieces of data that look the same, or I'm getting two recommendations, and I compare these, does this line up with my expectation? And I wish I could remember the person who gave me this analogy, but in the same way, especially when dealing with neural networks, you're not going to have someone who's going to go in and audit absolutely every piece of that. But in the same way, a drug sniffing dog isn't going to give you an explanation of their bark. What you can do is, did the dog find drugs or not? So you have real world scenarios that the business can really line up with and understand whether or not the criteria fits in, and establish some systematic piece of that. That also ensures ownership from the business side as well.
Good stuff. Well, we got like a zillion questions. I mean, I'm telling you, audience, you're doing a great job, because you're staying on board. We got questions, but I want to get to yours because you're the reason why we're here. Otherwise, we'd just be talking to each other. Nothing wrong with that. actually had a whole bunch of questions around really aspects of governance and explainability. There were like a bunch, actually. Chris Daly, you're doing a good job asking. So I'm going to kind of ask them. This is going to just speed of the group. So whoever can chime in, please do chime in. So this question has to do with about how much information we're capturing the metadata about AI and machine learning, right? So not the training data, but basically, are we capturing machine learning models, versioning, algorithmic choices that we're making, decisions that we are making around data inclusion or exclusion, and possibly for things like auditing to see if maybe we've implicitly allowed some sort of bias in the data set or something like that. Not just the actual model itself, but like all of these implicit decisions, explicit decisions that we're making. Can anybody talk to the extent to which we're tracking all of this, the system, we call it the systemic transparency issues, how much visibility we have into that? Who wants to chime in on that first? So I hope it won't be a mosh pit. Just jump in.
I can start this off. I really think that any tools that are out there really have to offer this up, especially in the public sector context, because when you move ahead with a decision, you have to own that as a bureaucrat, and that becomes part of public record. I know that when I'm working with like any of the drag and drop machine learning pieces that are in there, there's one part where it'll basically tell me, like, let's say forecasting models, right? A real basic piece of machine learning. Now, part of it will tell me whether or not the model is okay or poor, just simple feedback for someone who doesn't have the expertise. But then on top of that too, it'll start going into like trending, seasonality, someone in the intermediate side. And then as well, what it'll do is you can go and take a look at all of the descriptive statistics, the AIC out of the 7 models, what was selected. All these are important aspects. So as people go through, not only do they have this chain of custody of data for audits down the road, but then as well, they also have the ability to know what their decisions are being pinned on. So I'm completely in alignment with that. And I really think that has to be part of any sort of implementation that's out there.
Anybody else want to chime in? Yes, Scott.
Oh, I was going to say we're probably pretty early on our journey with respect to that kind of metadata model management type transactional activity, as we're and this kind of goes a little bit to the journey I think as some folks had talked a little bit about on the earlier panel of the democratization of AI and providing different tools and services. So it's something that at least from our road mapping perspective, that a place where we want to get to and recognize it as something that we need to, sort of invest in looking forward. Right now, we're kind of putting a little more of our eggs into the particular, the data reform, let's say the data reform bucket or basket, to try to get some of that, really that initial data that we're using to build the models or to share that information with the public in a little bit of better shape to then go kind of up that next stage on that particular value chain or curve, particularly as we expand our number of people trying to develop the models beyond a small subset of folks.
Excellent. Brian, did you want to talk about what are you seeing? Or Greg, go ahead. I'm sorry. Got you off.
Greg, I think you're on mute, sir.
There you go. Yeah, go ahead, Greg. Give it another shot.
This issue is of critical importance to medical applications and something the FDA has already encountered. If you've got a tool that's learning and ostensibly comes up with a better iteration, it's got to be evaluated whether it's clinically better. We've got to, the FDA ensures the safety and efficacy of tools. And just because the system's iterating doesn't mean that the FDA is that clinically that we're guaranteed. So keeping track of these versions is of critical interest in this business. So you hit on one of the critical issues that FDA is looking at, that metadata, that what these it's learning. What is it learning? And is it learning the way we think it should be learning?
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah, Brian, do you want to chime in as well on this issue of the metadata and the management of the process and the governance of all the decision making, and to I think Chris's question about is this machines managing machines? It sounds like it's really humans staying accountable in the loop for all this, right?
Yeah, and you know, going back to maturity observations, I would put us at like a level 1.5 in terms of metadata management, both for data and machine learning and model management and experimentation management. What I've observed is we're pretty good with data in terms of metadata management because that's a core practice area of kind of the data management communities of practice, and that's fairly mature and robust. What we're not seeing is in terms of data selection for model training and testing, you know, with your test and validation sets and how you make those decisions. Most of that is being done manually. And even some of the commercial tools out there that will help you with experiment management and documentation are really not answering all of the requirements that we have to capture those decisions in the model development process. And so I would say there's plenty of opportunity space for industry to provide tools that do this better. I would say there's plenty of opportunity space for us in the federal government to level up our organizational maturity and to do this better. Really just in terms of documenting design decisions along the way through the whole data science and experiment management process. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say, I saw we had some questions about explainable AI. And can we really get to explainable and will we ever know what's happening in the black box? Fortunately, for most of my portfolio, I get to take the broadest definition of AI on my project. So that includes, you know, it includes things like rules-based systems and expert systems and cognitive science related stuff, not just machine learning and deep learning tactics. So I approach explainability in really just from the perspective of, can you communicate the shortcomings of the techniques that you employed, and can you communicate the design decisions along the way that you that helped you arrive to the model performance that you have? That's a starting point for me, and it's common across all of those techniques. And then really, you know, once you get into like deep learning and, you know, hyperparameters tuning and you know, how do you explain that? I don't think we're quite there yet, but at a high level, those are the things that I try and address with explainability efforts. You know, what were the design decisions that you made and what are the shortcomings of the outputs?
Well, great. I know I'm seeing a lot of questions here, and hopefully we'll get a copy of the questions. We may have to address them offline because want to keep the event on time. We did start about 10 minutes late, so we're going to wrap about 10 minutes late, but that does leave us, I think, really to the last question. This is for everybody, including Yvonne. If you're on the phone, I'll have you end us on this one as well. And that really has to do with kind of where things are heading. I mean, like if you had to like get out your crystal ball a little bit and sort of predict a little bit as to kind of where you see AI adoption heading in general, and the guidebook perhaps as being a factor in that, or maybe, you know, part of that puzzle, or just in general, you know, are we heading into sort of are we in the spring of AI, the summer of AI? Hopefully we're not heading into the fall or the winter of AI for those of you that are familiar with the seasons. But maybe we could start again, Josh, and then Brian and Scott and sorry, Greg, and then Brian, Scott, Josh, and then we'll end with Yvonne on this one, and we'll wrap up this event.
Yeah, sounds great. What this really reminds me of, and even just looking at the maturity of the policy right now, we saw something very similar with social media, real strong centralization back in like 2008 within government departments, and then trying to control everything that was going on and becoming a bit more of a bottleneck. And I think we're kind of there right now, and it makes sense because there are some pretty big implications for AI implementation. I think as things become more democratized and spread out, things are going to shift a little bit on that front. And the same thing with the policy aspect is that policy right now, people are trying to figure out exactly what things look like in the same way that we had cybersecurity. But as institutional expertise develops, it's likely to become a little bit more refined in terms of where things are headed. And AI is a fairly broad topic as well. But what I can say in terms of Guidebook is, as long as it's addressing key areas for consumption along target audiences for executives, for policymakers, and for practitioners, that it's broken up in that respect, I think it could provide a lot of utility. One of the other things here too is like taking a comparative policy look at what's going on with other countries as well too. So I know Canada has the publicly available algorithm impact assessment tool that anyone can hop on and give a try. It covers off the business case, the system overview, decision oversight, and data sources within about 36 questions. So, you know, there are some additional starting points where it's not reinventing the policy wheel, where other ideas can be borrowed.
Excellent. You want to give us some final thoughts, a little crystal ball, kind of where things are heading?
I have one comment. As far as like where I think things are heading, I think reducing the barrier to AI is going to be key. So I'm looking at industry for the low code and no code solutions that fit into user workflows. I got to put my product manager hat on. Definitely meet the users where they are and make those tools available and as frictionless as possible.
All right, excellent. Okay, Greg, we'll give it another try. There you go. I think we got you on mute again. Give it another shot. There you go. Okay, there you got it.
The media has suggested that we're in a new era of government activism. I'm surprised I didn't get any takers, or I baited you all on an FCC for health IT. If you want to make money in this area, figure out how to get regulated, how to work with the government to create an environment where you can excel.
Excellent. Short and sweet. And Scott, why don't you chime in as well?
Sure. You know, AI is sexy. I don't think anyone, it's definitely sexy right now. I don't think anyone on the panel is going to disagree with that. But, you know, looking forward, you know, I think it was Drucker who talked about, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast in the end of the day. You know, I think what we're seeing on the, you know, in the federal space and, you know, in the AI and the innovation field is that a lot of these technologies are really starting to outpace the ability of organizations to adopt, absorb that particular change management, as well as sort of the data behind it to sort of measure the results. So, you know, I think, you know, looking forward, you know, a lot of folks are looking for 90%, what's sometimes referred to as, I need 90% of the information I wish I had before I can make a decision. You know, looking to the industry, looking to guidebooks and advice, you know, really encouraging that concept that it's okay to fail, but, you know, do it fast, but don't do it too often within the federal government if you want to get that next product. But, you know, how do we, you know, I think as we kind of get to that more closer and closer to that rate of change from the technologists to the people side, how do we get over that, you know, that valley, you know, as it were, you know, kind of from an organizational adoption culture, et cetera.
Excellent. And Yvonne, I'll give you the final word. I think you're still joining us here on the phone.
I am. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just really appreciate the conversation. And I think we have an opportunity here to use the guidebook to harmonize on, you know, key terms of reference and recommendations for data management and governance, and take that opportunity to showcase some of the success stories and the use cases, you know, their approach, successes, challenges, and possibly even performance measures. And so I really look forward to engaging with the different panel members and some of the folks that have participated in the summit. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, let's again give a round of applause here to our fabulous panels. You guys have been fantastic. To Mr. Greg Pappas and Josh Gilmore, Brian Lane, and Scott Beliveau, you guys have been fantastic. Yvonne Cole joining us and sharing as well. All the people who are on the working groups or ATARC helping make the guidebook happen. This is really all about you, our audience. Thank you so much for chiming in with your questions. We'll do our best to get them answered. And of course, it's my job. I know we have run a little bit late, but I will hand this back to the fabulous Kirsten Patton, who will get us, I think, wrapping up this event. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ron and panelists. Ron, you wrapped it up perfectly, so I don't have much to add other than I just want to remind everyone again, come join our working groups. This is how this summit got, you know, made into fruition. So we're really excited about all the activities and deliverables that are coming out of these various different project teams. So thank you to everyone who joined us as well. You guys had awesome questions. I think this is our most chatty summit that we've had yet. So love to see that. And I also want to thank our partners over at Octo, Confluent, and Tableau for helping us to put on such an excellent summit. Up next, ATARC will be hosting a webinar tomorrow, and we encourage you to join us for a discussion around cyber attacks and what the path forward will look like. So please go register, and we really look forward to seeing you there. Everyone have a great rest of your day.